Some men spend their whole lives running from their past, only to find redemption in the most unexpected places. At 68 years old, Cowboy Eli Monroe thought his story was already written. Decades of loneliness on the trail, mistakes he couldn't undo, and a family he'd left behind. Then his donkey found something that would change everything. Behind a forgotten stone gate in a New Mexico ghost town, Eli discovers an abandoned garden untouched since the 1930s. Hidden beneath a fig tree is a rusted tin box filled with letters from a woman named Lucia, whose story of loss mirrors his. But what secret does her garden hold that could give an old cowboy a second chance at life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The high desert stretched out in every direction, a canvas of muted browns and grays, broken only by patches of sage and the occasional yucca standing sentinel against the wind. Eli Monroe stood on the sagging porch of what passed for his home now, a weathered adobe structure at the edge of Esperanza, a ghost town that had given up on itself sometime around 1950. The morning air carried that particular quality of New Mexico light, sharp and clear, the kind that made distant mesas look close enough to touch. He was 68 years old, though his body reminded him of that fact more insistently with each passing season. His hands were scarred and rope-worn, his face deeply lined from decades under an unforgiving sun. He'd spent most of his adult life working cattle ranches across the Southwest, moving from spread to spread, never staying long enough to put down roots or answer too many questions about where he'd come from or why he traveled alone. Clementine stood in the small corral beside the house, her gray coat dusty despite Eli's efforts to keep her groomed. She was 23 years old, ancient for a donkey, and had been his companion for the last 15 years. He'd bought her from a rancher in Arizona who was going to put her down, said she was too old to work anymore. Eli had paid $50 and led her away without looking back. She was the closest thing to family he had now. The truth was, Eli had a family once. A wife named Sarah back in Colorado, a daughter named Grace, who would be 42 now, though he hadn't seen her since she was 12. He'd left them in 1997, drove away one morning before dawn without so much as a note. There were reasons, there were always reasons, but in the quiet moments before sleep, when memory had its way with him, those reasons felt thin as paper. He'd been drinking then, not falling down drunk every day, but enough to make him mean, enough to make him unreliable. Enough that Sarah had started flinching when he came through the door, and Grace had learned to make herself small and quiet. He'd told himself he was protecting them by leaving, that they'd be better off without him. Maybe they had been, but the cost of that protection had been 30 years of wondering, 30 years of carrying their faces in his mind like photographs he wasn't allowed to look at too long. Esperanza had 17 standing structures, most of them in various stages of collapse. There was an old church with half its roof caved in, a general store with the windows long since broken out, and a handful of houses that leaned against the wind like weary old men. The town had been a mining community once, silver mostly, but when the ore played out in the 40s, folks had simply walked away. Left their furniture, left their dishes on the tables, left their hopes buried in the played-out shafts that honeycombed the hills to the north. Eli had come here 6 months ago, after his last ranch job had ended. The foreman had been kind about it, said Eli had earned his rest, but they both knew the truth. His knees were bad, his back worse, and he moved slower than the work required. At his age, no one was hiring. So he'd heard about Esperanza from another drifter. Heard that a man could squat there without anyone bothering him, and he'd loaded what little he owned into his truck and driven south. The adobe house he'd claimed had belonged to someone named Valdez, according to a faded name carved into a beam over the doorway. It had good bones, thick walls that kept it cool in summer and held heat in winter, a tin roof that mostly didn't leak, and a well out back that still drew clean water. He'd spent weeks making it livable, patching holes, sweeping out decades of dust and the remnants of pack rat nests, replacing a few boards in the porch. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, and it was quiet. The quiet had been what he wanted. Out here he didn't have to pretend anymore. Didn't have to put on the easy smile and the laconic cowboy drawl that ranch owners expected. Didn't have to act like he hadn't made a mess of the one thing that had mattered. He could just be an old man with his old donkey, living out whatever time he had left without inflicting himself on anyone else. But the quiet had sharp edges too. In the evenings, when he sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, the silence pressed in. He'd catch himself listening for voices that weren't there, for Sarah humming in the kitchen, or Grace laughing at something on the television. The ghosts of Esperanza weren't the only ones haunting the place. Clementine brayed, pulling him from his thoughts. She stood at the corral fence, her long ears forward, looking toward the eastern edge of town, where the desert began to fold into low hills covered with juniper and pinon. She had that look she got when she wanted to walk, when staying still became unbearable, even for an old donkey who should have been content to doze in the shade. "All right," Eli said, pushing himself off the porch rail with a wince. "Let's go see what you're so interested in." He'd fallen into the habit of talking to Clementine as if she understood every word. Maybe she did. She certainly seemed to have opinions about things, and she'd saved his life more than once on the trail by refusing to go forward when the footing was bad or when she sensed something he couldn't see. Donkeys were like that, smarter than horses, more cautious and fiercely loyal once they decided you were worth their trouble. He bridled her loosely, not bothering with the saddle. His days of riding were mostly behind him. These days they walked together, Eli setting the pace, and Clementine following along or sometimes leading when the mood struck her. He grabbed his canteen and his walking stick, a gnarled piece of juniper he'd found on one of their previous walks, and together they headed east. The land rose gradually as they left the town behind. The desert here was beautiful in its austerity, all earth tones and vast skies, the kind of landscape that didn't apologize for being hard. Eli had always felt more at home in country like this than in gentler places. There was an honesty to it. The desert didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. They walked for perhaps half an hour, Clementine occasionally stopping to investigate a patch of dried grass or a particularly interesting rock. Eli let her set the pace. He'd learned long ago that hurrying in the desert was foolish. The land had its own rhythm, and it was better to move with it than against it. It was Clementine who noticed the wall first. She stopped suddenly, ears swiveling forward, and made a low rumbling sound in her chest that Eli had learned meant she'd found something unusual. He followed her gaze and saw it. A line of stones half hidden by scrub and creosote, running perpendicular to a dry wash that cut through the hillside. They moved closer. What he'd taken for a natural rock formation was actually a wall, carefully built from fitted stones, now mostly collapsed and overgrown. It ran for perhaps 30 feet before disappearing into the slope of the hill. At the center of it, barely visible beneath a tangle of wild grapevines and Russian olive, stood the remains of a gate. The gate was made of iron, its bars pitted with rust but still intact, set into stone pillars that had somehow survived while the wall around them crumbled. It was beautiful in a forgotten way, the kind of craftsmanship people didn't bother with anymore. Someone had cared enough to make this gate strong and beautiful, had cared enough to believe it would last. Eli approached slowly, mindful of the loose stones and hidden holes that littered the area. Clementine followed, her hooves surprisingly sure on the uncertain ground. Up close, he could see that the gate had once been painted. Traces of dark green still clung to the protected undersides of the bars. There was a lock, or had been, but it had rusted away to almost nothing. He tested the gate gently. It didn't budge. The vines had grown through and around it, binding it shut more effectively than any lock. He could have forced it, could have torn the vines away, but something made him hesitate. This place had been closed for a reason, had been left alone for decades. Whatever lay beyond that gate had been abandoned deliberately, and there was a kind of respect owed to that decision. But Clementine had no such reservations. She pushed past him, her nose working at the gap between the gate and the stone pillar. And then she was through, squeezing her body sideways with the practiced ease of an animal who'd spent years navigating tight spaces. She brayed once, sharp and insistent, and disappeared behind the wall. "Clementine, you stubborn creature," Eli muttered, but there was affection in it. He began pulling at the vines, careful not to disturb any snakes that might be sheltering in them, working the thick stems loose from the ironwork. It took him the better part of 20 minutes, and his hands were scratched and bleeding by the time he'd cleared enough to push the gate open. It shrieked on its hinges, a sound that sent a pair of ravens exploding from a nearby juniper in protest. Then it swung wide, and Eli stepped through into another world. The garden lay before him like a secret kept too long. It occupied a natural amphitheater in the hillside, protected from the worst of the wind by the surrounding rocks and trees. Someone had worked with the landscape rather than against it, creating terraces that followed the contours of the land, building low stone walls to hold the soil in place, diverting runoff from the hills above to feed the plants below. And the plants, despite decades of neglect, despite the absence of any human hand to tend them, still bloomed. Wild roses climbed over collapsed trellises, their pink flowers bright against the weathered wood. Herbs had escaped their original beds and spread across the garden in fragrant carpets. There were fruit trees, apples and pears gone wild and twisted, but alive, and what looked like the remains of a kitchen garden, where tomatoes and squash had reseeded themselves year after year, growing smaller and tougher but still producing. In the center of it all stood a fig tree, massive and ancient, its gnarled trunk splitting into multiple limbs that reached toward the sky. Even from where he stood, Eli could see the green figs hanging heavy on its branches. Clementine stood beneath the fig tree, pawing at the ground with one front hoof, her ears forward with interest. When Eli approached, she stepped aside, revealing what she'd uncovered, the corner of something metal, just visible beneath the thick mat of fallen leaves and soil that had accumulated around the tree's roots. Eli knelt, his knees protesting, and began to carefully brush away the debris. The metal was a tin box, roughly the size of a shoebox, so thoroughly rusted that it crumbled slightly under his fingers. But when he lifted it, he could feel the weight of something inside, something that had survived whatever the years had thrown at it. He sat back on his heels, the box in his lap, and looked up at the fig tree towering above him, at the garden spreading out in wild profusion around him, at the walls of stone that had protected this place for so long. Someone had loved this spot. Someone had poured time and care and hope into making it beautiful, and now, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, it felt like he was meant to find it. Clementine nuzzled his shoulder gently, as if to say she'd known all along. Eli carried the box back to his house, cradled against his chest, Clementine walking beside him with the satisfied air of someone who'd accomplished exactly what she'd set out to do. The afternoon heat had built while they'd been in the garden, and by the time they reached Esperanza, sweat had plastered his shirt to his back. He settled the donkey in her corral with fresh water and a coffee can of oats, then carried the box inside where the thick adobe walls kept the air cool. He set it on the kitchen table, a scarred piece of oak he'd salvaged from one of the abandoned houses, and studied it for a long moment before attempting to open it. The rust had fused the lid to the body in places, and he had to work carefully with a knife to pry it loose without destroying whatever might be inside. When the lid finally came free, with a squeal of protesting metal, he found himself holding his breath. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth but was now mostly disintegrated fabric, were letters. Perhaps 30 or 40 of them, written on various types of paper, some on proper stationery with deckled edges, others on pages torn from notebooks or the backs of seed catalogues. The ink had faded to brown, but the writing was still legible, a flowing feminine hand that spoke of education and care. Beneath the letters were other things. A bundle of sketches done in pencil, the paper brittle with age. A small leather journal, its cover water-stained but intact. A pressed flower, so fragile it was barely more than a ghost of what it had been. And at the very bottom, folded small and tight, a hand-drawn map. Eli unfolded the map first, spreading it carefully on the table. It showed the garden in detail. Every terrace, every tree, every stone wall and water channel. Notations in the margins identified plants by name. Rosa rugosa along the east wall, salvia rosemary in the herb beds, mission figs in the center. Someone had planned that garden with the precision of an architect and the passion of a poet. At the bottom of the map, in that same careful hand, was written, Lucia's garden. Planted 1932, tended with love. He set the map aside and picked up one of the letters at random. It was dated June 15, 1936, and addressed to My Dearest James. The garden thrives despite this terrible drought, it began. The fig tree Papa planted that first year now towers over everything else, and I've counted nearly 200 figs on its branches. The roses struggle, but I've learned to give them extra water drawn from the spring in the early morning when it's coolest. Each bloom feels like a small miracle in a world that seems determined to turn to dust. I went into town yesterday to sell vegetables and herbs. Mrs. Patterson bought all the tomatoes. I could spare and asked about Papa again. I told her the same thing I tell everyone, that he's gone to Santa Fe to consult with colleagues about his research. It's easier than the truth, which is that I don't know where he is or if he's even alive. It's been 14 months now since he walked into the hills and didn't come back. The sheriff says he's given up the search. Says Papa probably got lost and died of exposure or fell into one of the old mine shafts that honeycomb these hills. He doesn't say what I know we're both thinking, that Papa's mind had been failing for months before he disappeared, that he'd started forgetting things and getting confused, that the brilliant botanist who taught at the university had become someone who sometimes didn't recognize his own daughter. I keep the garden because it's what he would have wanted, because it's the last thing we built together, the last time I saw him truly himself, and because as long as I'm tending it, I can pretend he's just away on one of his collecting trips, that he'll come walking down the path any day now with his specimen bags full of seeds and cuttings, ready to tell me about everything he's discovered. The loneliness here is vast. James, some days I feel like I'm the only person left in the world. Just me and this garden and the ghosts of better times. The letter went on, but Eli had to stop. His hands were shaking slightly, and something in his chest had pulled tight. He understood that kind of loneliness, that feeling of maintaining something beautiful while the world moved on without you. The waiting for someone who would never come back. He set the letter down and picked up another. This one from October of the same year. I've decided to seal the garden, it read. This drought shows no signs of breaking, and people are leaving by the dozens. Esperanza is dying, James, and I can't bear to watch it anymore. The Johnsons left last week. The Chens the week before that. Even Reverend Morrison is talking about going back to Missouri. I'm going to Santa Fe, to Papa's house there. His attorney says it's mine now, along with a small stipend from the university. It's not much, but it's enough to live on if I'm careful. I can't stay here any longer. The memories are too heavy, and the silence is too deep, but I can't abandon the garden entirely. I've built a wall around it, made a proper gate. I've redirected the spring, so it feeds directly into the fig tree's roots. It should survive even without me. The herbs will reseed themselves, and the roses are hardy enough to manage on their own. In a few years, it will all go wild, but it will still be here, still growing. Still testament to what Papa and I created together. I've buried this box beneath the fig tree, with all your letters and my sketches and the map of the garden. If anyone ever finds it, I hope they'll understand what this place meant to us. I hope they'll see the love we poured into this soil. I'm not giving up. James, I'm just letting go. The letter was signed, yours always. Lucia. Eli sat back in his chair, staring at the letters spread across his table. Lucia had been real. Her father had been real. This garden he'd stumbled into wasn't just an accident of nature. It was the carefully tended dream of two people who'd tried to make something beautiful in a hard place, and who'd lost each other in the trying. He picked up the leather journal and opened it carefully. The first entry was dated March 1932, and it detailed the initial planning of the garden. Lucia wrote about her father's excitement, his theories about water conservation and companion planting, his belief that even in the high desert, with proper planning and care, a person could grow almost anything. There were sketches of the terraces they'd planned, notes about soil amendments and native plants that might serve as nurse crops for more delicate specimens. As he read through the entries, a picture emerged of a young woman. She'd been 22 when she started the journal, working alongside her father to create something lasting. Her love for him came through on every page, as did her growing concern as his mind began to fail. The later entries were heartbreaking, recording his confusion, his moments of clarity that became fewer and farther between, his disappearance, and finally, her decision to leave. The final entry was dated November 3rd, 1936. Tomorrow I close the gate for the last time. I've said my goodbyes to the fig tree, to the roses Papa brought all the way from his mother's garden in Pennsylvania, to the herbs that smell like comfort and home. I've walked every path, touched every stone wall we built together. This garden was supposed to be our sanctuary, our proof that beauty could survive even in harsh times. Instead, it became my prison, the place where I watched Papa slip away bit by bit until there was nothing left but a confused old man who didn't know his own name. But I can't hate it. I can't hate something we made with such love, such hope. So I'm sealing it away, preserving it like a pressed flower between the pages of a book. Maybe someday someone will find it. Maybe they'll restore it. Maybe they'll understand that this was more than just a garden. It was a promise we made to each other, that life could be good, that growing things could heal us, that we could make the desert bloom. Papa never got to see that promise fulfilled. But the garden remains, and that has to be enough. Eli closed the journal and sat in the gathering twilight, not bothering to light a lamp. Outside, he could hear Clementine shifting in her corral, the soft sound she made as she settled for the night. The house creaked around him as the day's heat began to dissipate. He thought about Lucia, 22 years old, and losing her father by inches before losing him entirely. He thought about her tending that garden alone, trying to hold on to something that was already slipping away. He thought about her walking away from it, sealing it behind that iron gate, burying these letters and journals and maps where no one would find them unless they were meant to. And he thought about himself, 68 years old, alone in a ghost town with a donkey and a lifetime of regrets he'd never had the courage to face. He'd run from his family, just like Lucia had run from her garden. The difference was that she'd done it out of necessity, to survive, while he'd done it out of cowardice, out of fear that he'd do more damage by staying than by leaving. But she'd left something behind worth finding. She'd created something beautiful, something that endured. What had he left behind? A daughter who probably hated him? A wife who'd had to rebuild her life without him? Empty years and empty rooms, and the slow erosion of a man who'd never been brave enough to face his own failures. The questions sat heavy in the dark room, unanswered and maybe unanswerable. But outside that house, beyond the collapsed buildings and abandoned dreams of Esperanza, there was a garden. Wild and overgrown, yes, but still alive, still blooming, still testament to what two people had created out of love and hope and determination. And for the first time in 30 years, Eli Monroe felt the stirring of something he'd thought was long dead, the possibility that it wasn't too late, that maybe, just maybe, a man could find redemption in the most unexpected places, even if that place was an abandoned garden behind a rusted gate, tended now only by memory and time. Eli didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table with Lucia's letters and journal spread before him, reading by lamplight until his eyes burned and the words blurred together. When the sky began to lighten toward dawn, he made coffee and carried the cup out to the porch. watching the sun rise over the desert hills that hid the garden. Clementine was already awake, standing at the corral fence as if she'd been waiting for him. When their eyes met, she brayed once, a sound that seemed to carry equal parts impatience and encouragement. "I know," he said. "I'm going." He gathered supplies before heading out. A pair of heavy gloves he'd used for working with barbed wire. Pruning shears he'd bought years ago but rarely used. A rake, a shovel, a coil of rope. His canteen filled with fresh water. He loaded it all into an old canvas pack, then stopped and went back for Lucia's sketches. He'd studied them in the night, marveling at her skill with a pencil, the way she'd captured not just the shape of each plant, but its essential character. The roses looked thorny even on paper. The herbs seemed to give off their fragrance through the page. The walk to the garden took less time now that he knew the way. Clementine led him confidently, her ears forward, her steps surprisingly spry for an animal her age. When they reached the gate, still hanging open from yesterday, she passed through without hesitation and made straight for the fig tree. Eli followed more slowly, taking in the garden with fresh eyes. In Lucia's sketches, it had been ordered and beautiful, each plant in its designated place, the paths clear and well swept, the stone walls pristine. What lay before him now was chaos. Beauty run wild, yes, but chaos nonetheless. Decades of growth had obscured the original design. Vines covered walls. Trees had seeded themselves where they didn't belong. The paths had vanished beneath accumulated soil and leaf litter. It would take months to restore, maybe longer. The work would be hard, and he was an old man with bad knees and a back that seized up when he bent over too long. But standing there in the morning light, with Clementine nosing at the fig tree and Lucia's sketches in his pack, Eli realized he wanted to try. For the first time in decades, he wanted something beyond simple survival. He wanted to see this garden the way Lucia had intended it. He wanted to honor what she and her father had created. He started with the paths. According to the sketches, there were 5 main paths radiating from the central fig tree, with smaller connecting trails between the terraced beds. He paced off the measurements, comparing what he saw to Lucia's drawings, and began to scrape away the debris with his shovel. The work was slow and methodical. Beneath the accumulated years, he found the original stones that had marked the path edges, flat river rocks that someone had carefully selected and placed. By midday, he'd uncovered perhaps 20 feet of the main eastern path. His back ached and his hands throbbed despite the gloves, but the satisfaction of seeing that clean line of stones emerge from the chaos kept him going. He took a break in the shade of the fig tree, drinking water and sharing a sandwich with Clementine, who'd spent the morning alternating between following him around and dozing in the cool spots. "What do you think?" he asked her. "Am I crazy for doing this?" She regarded him with those calm, dark eyes that always seemed to hold more understanding than a donkey should possess, then returned to her dozing. In the afternoon, he moved to the herb beds. These had been on the lowest terrace, according to Lucia's notes, positioned to receive runoff from the higher levels. The plants were still there. He could identify rosemary by its woody stems and needle-like leaves, thyme by its tiny leaves and spreading habit, sage by its distinct aroma. But they'd spread far beyond their original boundaries, mingling with weeds and native grasses. He consulted the sketches again. Lucia had drawn each herb bed with precise dimensions, had labeled each plant with both common and Latin names. She'd been systematic in her approach, organizing the herbs by their water needs and growth habits. The Mediterranean varieties, rosemary, thyme, oregano, were grouped together in the driest section. The more water-loving herbs, mint, lemon balm, parsley, occupied the area closest to the spring. Eli began to prune, to shape, to reclaim. He worked carefully, mindful that these plants had been growing wild for 80 years, that they'd survived without human intervention and deserved respect for their resilience. He removed dead wood and thinned out the overcrowded sections, but he didn't cut too aggressively. This garden had found its own balance. His job was to nudge it back toward Lucia's vision, not to impose his will upon it. As he worked, he found himself talking to Lucia. Not out loud, that would have felt too strange, but in his head, a running commentary on what he was doing and why. He imagined her responding, offering advice or approval, pointing out things he'd missed. It was a peculiar form of companionship, this conversation with a woman who'd been dead for decades. But it eased the loneliness in a way he hadn't expected. When the sun began to drop toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Eli gathered his tools and took one last look at what he'd accomplished. The eastern path was visible again, a clear line through the garden. The herb beds showed the beginnings of order. It wasn't much, measured against the enormity of the task ahead, but it was a start. He and Clementine walked back to Esperanza in the soft evening light. His muscles ached in ways he'd almost forgotten, the good ache of physical labor that served a purpose. His mind felt clearer than it had in years, focused on something beyond his own regrets. That night, he heated a can of beans for dinner and ate on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast desert sky. Later, before bed, he returned to Lucia's journal and read more of her entries from that first year, learning about her father's theories on water conservation, about the challenges they'd faced in getting plants to establish in the alkaline soil, about their small triumphs when something bloomed or fruited against all odds. In one entry from July 1932, she wrote, "Papa says that tending a garden is an act of faith. You plant seeds not knowing if they'll grow. You water and weed and prune, trusting that your labor will bear fruit. Some years the drought wins. Some years the insects devour everything. But you keep planting, keep tending, keep believing that next year will be better." He says that's not just true of gardens, it's true of life itself. Eli closed the journal and sat in the dark, thinking about faith and second chances, about seeds planted and labor that might bear fruit. He thought about his daughter Grace, 42 years old now, living a life he knew nothing about. He thought about Sarah, who'd rebuilt her world without him. He thought about all the years he'd wasted running from his failures instead of facing them. The garden couldn't fix any of that. Restoring Lucia's terraces and paths wouldn't undo the damage he'd done or the time he'd lost. But maybe, and this was the faith Lucia's father had written about, maybe doing this work would change something in him. Maybe making something beautiful out of what had been abandoned would teach him how to approach his own abandoned relationships. It was a fragile hope, barely more substantial than those pressed flowers in Lucia's tin box. But it was hope nonetheless, and Eli held on to it as he finally surrendered to sleep, dreaming of gardens and second chances and paths that led somewhere other than away. The work became Eli's routine. Each morning he woke with the sun, made coffee, checked on Clementine, and walked to the garden with his tools. Some days he could manage 4 or 5 hours of labor before his body demanded rest. Other days, when his back seized up or his knees refused to bend properly, he could barely manage 2. But he went every day, and slowly, incrementally, the garden began to reveal itself. He found the spring on his 5th day. It bubbled up from the rocks on the northern edge of the garden, clear and cold, even in the summer heat. Lucia had written about it in her journal. Her father had chosen this site specifically because of the spring, recognizing it as the key to their garden's survival. They'd built an elaborate system to channel the water, using carved stone gutters and carefully graded paths to distribute it throughout the terraces. Most of that system was buried now, clogged with decades of silt and plant debris. Eli spent 3 days excavating it, working with a small hand trowel to avoid damaging the stonework. The channels were beautiful once he uncovered them. Smooth river stones fitted together without mortar, relying solely on precision and patience to stay in place. The craftsmanship spoke of another era, when people built things to last not just years but generations. As he worked to clear the channels, water began to flow again, finding its ancient paths through the garden. He watched it spread across the terraces, soaking into soil that had relied only on sparse rain for 80 years. The plants responded almost immediately. Within days, the roses showed new growth. The herbs thickened and spread. Even the old fruit trees seemed to stand a bit straighter, their leaves darkening to a healthier green. But the work took its toll. One morning, in his second week, Eli woke to find his hands so swollen he could barely make a fist. His fingers had gone stiff overnight, the joints inflamed from too many hours gripping tools, pulling weeds, lifting stones. He made coffee one-handed, swearing under his breath at his body's betrayal, and sat on the porch trying to decide what to do. Clementine came to stand at the fence, watching him with that patient attention she had. "I'm getting too old for this," he told her. "Maybe I should just let it go back to being wild. It's done fine without me for 80 years. But even as he said it, he knew he wouldn't stop. Couldn't stop. The garden had gotten into him somehow, had given him a purpose that went beyond just passing time, until death caught up with him. He thought about Lucia tending these same beds, fighting the same fatigue and frustration, and he understood that the work itself was the point. The struggle was what made the beauty meaningful. He spent that day doing lighter work, walking the paths he'd cleared and studying Lucia's sketches, planning his next projects. There were trellises that needed rebuilding, walls that needed repair, entire sections of the garden that were still choked with overgrowth. The task was enormous, maybe impossible for one old man working alone. The thought didn't discourage him as much as it might have once. He'd learned something in these weeks of labor, that progress wasn't measured in completion, but in continuity. Every stone he placed, every path he cleared, every channel he uncovered added to what Lucia and her father had begun. He was part of a chain now, a link between their work and whatever future the garden might have. That evening, nursing his swollen hands, he returned to Lucia's letters. He'd been reading them chronologically, following her journey from hope to heartbreak. But tonight he shuffled through them, looking for something specific, any mention of James, the man to whom most of her letters were written. He found references scattered throughout. James had been her fiancé, it seemed, a teacher at the university where her father had worked. They'd planned to marry in the fall of 1936, but something had happened. The letters never said exactly what, but the tone shifted in the later ones, becoming more formal, more distant. The last letter addressed to James was dated September 1936, just 2 months before she sealed the garden. "I understand your decision," it read, "and I can't say it surprises me. A woman with a missing father and no prospects is hardly the wife a young professor needs to advance his career. I hope you find what you're looking for, James. I hope your life is everything you want it to be. As for me, I'm leaving this place. I'm sealing the garden that Papa and I built together, and I'm going to try to build a different kind of life in Santa Fe. I don't know what that will look like. I don't know if I'll ever stop missing what I've lost. Papa, you, this garden, the life I thought I was going to have. But I'm not giving up. I'm just letting go of the things I can't hold on to anymore. Maybe that's the same thing. Maybe it's not. I suppose I'll find out." Eli set the letter down and stared out at the darkening desert. Lucia had lost everyone. Her father to illness and the unforgiving landscape, her fiancé to ambition or cowardice or simple bad timing. She'd poured her love into that garden, and then she'd walked away from it because staying would have destroyed her. He knew something about that kind of leaving, about recognizing that you were poison to the people you loved, that the kindest thing you could do was remove yourself from their lives. The difference was that Lucia had left with grace and dignity, had sealed something beautiful behind her. He'd left with nothing, no letters, no explanations, just an empty space where a husband and father should have been. The next morning, despite his still swollen hands, he was back in the garden. He worked more carefully now, taking frequent breaks, being mindful of his body's limits. Clementine stayed close, as if sensing that he needed the companionship. Sometimes she'd nuzzle his shoulder or stand so close he could lean against her solid warmth when his back demanded rest. By the end of the 3rd week, he'd cleared all 5 main paths and restored the spring's water channels to full function. The garden was beginning to look intentional again, less wild chaos and more cultivated beauty. He could see the bones of Lucia's design emerging, the way she'd arranged plants by height and color, the strategic placement of the stone walls to create microclimates, the clever terracing that maximized water retention. One afternoon, while working on the rose bed along the eastern wall, he uncovered a stone marker half buried in the soil. He cleaned it off and found an inscription carved into its face, in memory of Miguel Alvarez, whose vision made the desert bloom. 1870–1936, Lucia's father. Eli sat back on his heels, holding the marker in his damaged hands, and felt the weight of time and loss settle over him. Miguel Alvarez had died the same year his daughter sealed the garden. Had probably died somewhere in these hills, confused and alone, while Lucia searched for him. All his knowledge, all his passion for making things grow, all his careful planning, it had ended in those barren hills. And his daughter had been left to grieve without even the comfort of a body to bury. But this marker remained. And the garden remained. The fig tree he'd planted still bore fruit. The roses he'd brought from his mother's Pennsylvania garden still bloomed. The water channels he'd carved still carried water to thirsty plants. Miguel Alvarez was gone, but his work endured. Eli cleaned the marker thoroughly and reset it at the base of the fig tree, where it could stand as a proper memorial. Then he stood and looked around at the garden he was slowly bringing back to life. And he thought about legacy and remembrance and the things people leave behind that matter more than the mistakes they made. That night, for the first time since he'd left Colorado 30 years ago, Eli took out a piece of paper and tried to write a letter to his daughter. The letter to Grace went through 7 drafts before Eli gave up and burned them all in the wood stove. Each attempt felt false, inadequate. How did you apologize for 30 years of absence? How did you explain walking away from a 12-year-old girl and never looking back? The words seemed cheap measured against the magnitude of what he'd done. He kept working in the garden instead, letting the physical labor quiet the thoughts that circled like vultures in his mind. The work was honest, in a way the letters couldn't be. Every stone he placed was real. Every channel he cleared actually accomplished something. There was comfort in that certainty, even if it couldn't solve his larger problems. On a morning in his 4th week, while clearing debris from what had been a decorative pond on the upper terrace, he found the tiles. They were broken, most of them, fractured by freeze-thaw cycles and the weight of accumulated earth. But even shattered, their beauty was evident. Each tile was roughly 4 inches square, and painted with botanical designs. A single flower or leaf rendered in blues and greens and earth tones that had somehow survived 80 years of neglect. He spent the rest of that day excavating them carefully, brushing away dirt to reveal the designs. Some depicted roses, their petals unfurling in careful detail. Others showed herbs, rosemary sprigs, sage leaves, lavender blooms. A few featured the distinctive 3-lobed leaves of fig trees. Altogether, he uncovered perhaps 30 tiles, maybe a third of them intact, the rest broken but still identifiable. That evening, he arranged the intact ones on his kitchen table and studied them by lamplight. The artistry was remarkable, each tile a tiny masterpiece of botanical illustration. In Lucia's journal, he found a reference to them. Her father had made them himself, had taught himself pottery and painting, specifically for the garden, wanting every element to reflect the plants they were cultivating. He'd fired them in a makeshift kiln behind the house, glazed them with minerals he'd collected from the surrounding hills. Eli picked up one of the broken pieces, a tile that showed half of a rose bloom, the rest lost to a crack that ran diagonally across its surface. He turned it over in his scarred hands, thinking about broken things and whether they could be mended. The next day, instead of working in the garden, he drove his truck into the nearest town with actual shops and people. It was 40 miles away, a sun-baked collection of buildings that called itself Tres Hermanas. He bought adhesive suitable for outdoor ceramics, grout, and a book on tile restoration from a hardware store. The woman at the register, perhaps 70 herself, with weathered hands and kind eyes, asked what he was working on. "Restoring an old garden," he said, surprising himself with the admission. He hadn't talked to anyone besides Clementine in weeks around here. She sounded skeptical. Not much grows in this country without a lot of work. Someone put in the work a long time ago. I'm just trying to bring it back. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. Well, good for you. We need more growing things and fewer abandoned ones. On the drive back, her words stayed with him. More growing things and fewer abandoned ones. It was a simple sentiment, but it settled into his chest like a stone dropping into water, sending ripples outward. He spent the next 3 days working on the tiles at his kitchen table, fitting broken pieces together like puzzles, filling gaps with careful lines of adhesive. Some could be fully restored. Others he could only partially repair, leaving visible cracks and missing sections. A few were too far gone, reduced to fragments too small to be useful. He didn't throw the fragments away. Instead, he kept them in a small wooden box, thinking that maybe he'd find a use for them later. Maybe they could become part of a mosaic or a pathway marker. Maybe broken things didn't need to be perfect to still have value. While the adhesive dried, he returned to the garden with renewed purpose. He decided where the tiles should go, around the edge of the pond on the upper terrace, creating a decorative border that would echo Lucia's father's original vision. But first, he needed to excavate and restore the pond itself. It was hard work. The pond had been dug into the hillside and lined with clay, but 80 years of erosion had filled it with sediment and broken down the clay lining. He spent days hauling out buckets of dirt, his back screaming protest with each load. Clementine watched from the shade of a nearby juniper, occasionally wandering over to inspect his progress. As he dug, he found more evidence of Miguel Alvarez's craftsmanship. The pond's bottom was lined with smooth river stones, arranged in a spiral pattern that would have been visible when the water was clear. The inlet from the spring had been carefully positioned to create circulation, preventing stagnation. Even the outlet that fed water to the lower terraces had been designed with thought, a notched stone that controlled the flow rate, ensuring the pond stayed full while still irrigating the garden below. Eli worked to restore it all, replacing damaged stones, clearing channels, rebuilding the clay lining using techniques he'd learned decades ago on a ranch in Arizona. The work consumed him in the best possible way, leaving no room for regret or self-recrimination. There was only the task at hand, the problem to be solved, the incremental progress towards something worthwhile. One afternoon, while shaping clay around the pond's edge, he found himself thinking about Grace, not the abstract idea of her, the guilt-laden ghost that haunted his thoughts, but the actual girl she'd been. She'd loved helping in the garden behind their house in Colorado, would show up after school with dirt already on her jeans from playing outside, ready to pull weeds or water vegetables or collect tomatoes in her t-shirt pulled up like a basket. Sarah had called her their little farmer, said she had a gift for making things grow. Eli had been too drunk or too tired or too lost in his own darkness to see it then. But now, with his hands in clay and his back bent over work that mattered, he could finally recognize that gift for what it was. Grace had been like Lucia, like Miguel Alvarez, someone who understood that growing things was an act of faith, a way of saying that tomorrow mattered, that beauty was worth the effort even in hard country. He'd stolen that from her when he left. Not just his presence, but the affirmation that her gift was real and valuable. The knowledge that her father saw her clearly and loved what he saw. That night he tried writing to her again. This time he didn't attempt explanations or apologies. He just described the garden, told her about Lucia and her father, about the tiles and the pond and the fig tree that had survived 80 years of neglect. He wrote about finding purpose in restoration, about how tending abandoned beauty had taught him things he'd been too broken to learn before. He didn't mail it. Wasn't even sure he had an address to mail it to, but he kept it, folded in Lucia's journal. Another piece of the puzzle he was slowly assembling. Another fragment that might someday fit into something whole. In the morning, he carried the restored tiles back to the garden and began setting them around the pond's rim, each one placed with care. each one a small act of faith that broken things could be made beautiful again. The pond took shape over the next week. With the tiles set and the clay lining restored, Eli diverted water from the spring and watched as it slowly filled, the surface reflecting sky and clouds and the branches of the trees that arched overhead. It was smaller than he'd imagined from Lucia's descriptions, maybe 8 feet across, but perfect in its proportions. The spiral of river stones on the bottom showed through the clear water, and the tiles around the rim caught the light, their painted flowers seeming to bloom anew. He sat beside it on a flat boulder and felt something close to pride, an emotion he hadn't experienced in so long he almost didn't recognize it. This was his work, not perfect. Some tiles remained cracked, some sections of the clay lining were thicker than others, but functional and beautiful. A thing restored because he'd chosen to restore it. That evening, exhausted and satisfied, he emptied his pockets before washing up for dinner. Out came his knife, some twine, a few small stones he'd collected for no reason he could articulate. And then, from the deepest corner of his wallet where he'd carried it for 30 years, he pulled out a folded piece of paper, so worn at the creases it was nearly transparent. Grace's letter. The last thing of hers he had. He'd found it in his truck the day after he left, tucked under the sun visor where she must have hidden it, knowing he'd find it eventually. He'd pulled over on some nameless highway in Utah, read it once, and then put it away. He hadn't looked at it since, but he'd kept it close, carried it through every job and every town, a penance and a reminder of what he'd abandoned. Now, with his hands clean from washing off the day's clay and dirt, he unfolded it carefully on the kitchen table. The paper was lined notebook paper, the handwriting careful and neat, the kind of perfect penmanship teachers praised. She'd been 12 years old. "Dear Dad," it began. "I know things are hard right now. I hear you and Mom fighting at night when you think I'm asleep. I know you're sad and angry, and I don't really understand why, but I wish I could help. Mom says you have demons. I looked that up, and it means you have things inside you that hurt and make you hurt other people. I don't think you mean to hurt us. I think you just hurt yourself so much that it spills over. I want you to know that I love you even when you're mean, even when you smell like whiskey and don't remember to pick me up from school, even when you make Mom cry. I love you because you're my dad, and because sometimes when you're feeling good, you teach me things about animals and plants, and you tell me stories about when you were young. I planted those tomatoes you gave me last spring. Remember? You showed me how to put them deep in the ground and water them just right. They're growing really big now. I take care of them every day. Every time I water them, I think about you teaching me, and it makes me happy. I hope you stop hurting soon. I hope your demons go away. I hope we can plant a garden together next year. Love, Grace." Eli read it 3 times, each reading worse than the last. She'd been 12 years old, and she'd understood more about him than he'd understood about himself. She'd seen his demons clearly, had loved him anyway, had held on to hope that he'd get better, and he'd driven away 6 days later without a word. He sat at the table as the light faded, Grace's letter in his shaking hands, and let himself feel the full weight of what he'd done, not abstractly, not as a distant regret, but as the immediate and shattering reality that he'd abandoned a child who'd loved him, who'd tried to save him with tomatoes and careful handwriting and a hope he hadn't deserved. Clementine brayed from the corral, a sound that pierced the evening stillness. Eli stood on stiff legs and went out to check on her, grateful for the interruption. She stood at the fence, her ears forward, looking toward the garden. "Not tonight," he told her. "I can't go tonight," but sleep wouldn't come when he finally lay down. He stared at the ceiling and thought about Grace watering those tomatoes, thought about her watching for his truck after school, thought about the moment she realized he wasn't coming back. What had Sarah told her? How had they explained his absence? Had they told her the truth, that her father was a coward who'd chosen the bottle and the empty road over his own family? In the morning, he returned to the garden not because he wanted to, but because he didn't know what else to do. The work had become his anchor, the only thing that kept him tethered to something resembling purpose. Without it, he'd drift back into the darkness that had swallowed most of his life. He worked on the rosebed that day, pruning back the wild growth, trying to encourage the plants back toward their original trained forms along the eastern wall. The work was delicate, requiring attention and care, which meant he couldn't think too much about Grace or the letter, or the 30 years he'd wasted. But Lucia's journal had a passage about roses that he read during his lunch break. Sitting in the shade with his sandwich and water, "Papa says roses teach us about love," she'd written. "They require patience and attention. They have thorns that draw blood if you're careless. They need regular pruning, which seems cruel, but is actually kindness, cutting away the dead and diseased so the healthy parts can thrive." He says people are like that too. Sometimes the kindest thing is to cut away the parts of ourselves that are dying, even though it hurts, so something better can grow. Eli closed the journal and looked at the roses he'd been pruning. He'd removed so much dead wood that morning, branches that looked substantial but were hollow inside, brown and brittle. Left alone, they'd drain resources from the living parts of the plant, eventually killing everything. Was that what he'd tried to do by leaving? Cut away the diseased parts of himself to let his family thrive? The logic had made sense at the time. Drunk and desperate and convinced he was poison to everyone he touched. But roses didn't prune themselves. They needed a gardener who could see the whole plant, who understood that some cuts would help and others would only cause harm. He'd made the wrong cuts, had removed himself entirely when what might have helped was to cut away just the drinking, just the anger, just the self-destructive patterns that had been killing him from the inside. But that would have required staying. That would have required facing the hard work of actually changing, actually healing, actually becoming someone his daughter could trust to water the tomatoes with her. That afternoon, he found himself talking out loud to Lucia as he worked. Something he'd been doing more often lately. "I don't know if I can fix this," he said, securing a rose cane to the trellis he'd rebuilt. "It's been too long. She probably doesn't want to hear from me. Probably has a life that doesn't include the father who abandoned her." The garden offered no answers, but the work continued. The roses took shape under his hands. The channels carried water where it was needed. The pond reflected the sky. Small beauties accumulated through persistent effort, adding up to something that mattered. As the sun dropped toward the western hills, Eli stood back and surveyed what he'd accomplished. The rosebed was transformed, the wild tangle now revealed as carefully trained plants that would bloom in profusion come spring. It wasn't the same as Lucia's original vision. 30 years of growth couldn't be entirely erased, but it was beautiful in its own way. Honoring her design while acknowledging all the years between then and now, maybe that was the answer. Not trying to go back to what had been, but taking what remained and making something new from it. Acknowledging the gaps and losses while still moving forward, still tending, still believing that growth was possible even in hard country. That night, he wrote another letter to Grace. This one was different, shorter, more honest. "Dear Grace," it said, "I found your letter. I've carried it for 30 years, too ashamed to read it, too unable to let it go. You saw me clearly even at 12, and you loved me anyway. I didn't deserve that love, and I didn't know what to do with it, so I ran. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that I remember the tomatoes. I remember teaching you to plant them deep and water them right. I remember that you had a gift for growing things, and I'm sorry I wasn't there to help you cultivate it. I'm working in a garden now, restoring something someone else abandoned. It's teaching me about patience and care and the faith it takes to tend growing things. It's teaching me what I should have learned when you were 12 and planting tomatoes and hoping your father would get better. I don't know if this letter will ever reach you. I don't even know if I'll send it. But I needed to write it. Needed to tell you that you were right to hope, even though I failed you. Needed to say that every seed that grows, every plant that blooms, reminds me of you and what I lost when I drove away." He signed it simply, Dad, folded it carefully, and placed it with the other unsent letters in Lucia's journal. Between the pages where she'd written about roses and pruning, and the cruel kindness of cutting away dead things so life could continue, Eli was working on the lower terrace, installing a new trellis for the climbing roses when he heard Clementine's alarm bray. It wasn't her usual sound. This was sharp, insistent, the noise she made when strangers approached. He straightened slowly, his hand going to the hammer at his belt, more from instinct than any real thought of needing a weapon. A figure stood at the garden gate, a woman backlit by the afternoon sun, her features lost in shadow and glare. She was tall, wearing jeans and a light jacket despite the heat, and she stood very still, as if uncertain whether to come forward or retreat. "This is private property," Eli called out, his voice rougher than he'd intended. He hadn't spoken to another human being in weeks. "I know," the woman said. Her voice carried clearly across the garden, and something in it made Eli's chest tighten. "I've been looking for you for 3 months, Mr. Monroe." He knew that voice. Hadn't heard it in 30 years, but he knew it the way you know a song from childhood, the way memory lives in your bones before your brain can name it. He took a step forward, then another, his legs moving on their own while his mind struggled to catch up. The woman stepped into the garden, out of the glare, and Eli saw her face clearly for the first time. She was in her 40s, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, features that held echoes of Sarah mixed with his own stubborn chin and deep-set eyes. She wore an expression he couldn't quite read, part determination, part uncertainty, part something that might have been hope or might have been fear. "Grace," he said, and his voice broke on her name. "Hello, Dad." They stood 15 feet apart, the restored garden spreading around them, neither moving closer. Clementine had gone quiet, watching them both with her calm, patient attention. "How did you find me?" The question came out before Eli could think of anything better to say. Before he could say any of the 1,000 things he'd been writing in unsent letters, before he could apologize, or explain, or beg forgiveness. "I hired a private investigator 6 months ago," Grace said. She spoke carefully, as if she'd rehearsed this. "He traced you through employment records, Social Security filings. You worked at the Bartee Ranch in Arizona until last year. The foreman there said you'd mentioned heading to New Mexico, somewhere quiet. It took the investigator 2 months to find someone who'd seen your truck in Tres Hermanas. The woman at the hardware store remembered you, said you were restoring an old garden." Eli felt dizzy, the world tilting around him. All those years of running, of trying to disappear, and she'd found him in 6 months because he'd bought tile adhesive and talked to a woman at a cash register. "Why?" he asked. "Why were you looking for me?" Grace reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a photograph, faded and creased from handling. She held it out, and when he didn't move, she walked forward and placed it in his scarred hand. It was them, all 3 of them. The photo had been taken in the backyard of their Colorado house, in front of the vegetable garden. Sarah stood in the middle, smiling, one arm around Grace, maybe 10 years old in the picture, gap-toothed and sun-browned. And Eli stood on Sarah's other side, his hand on her shoulder, looking at his daughter with an expression of such uncomplicated love that it hurt to see it. He'd forgotten that version of himself had ever existed. The man in the photograph looked happy, looked whole, looked like someone who knew what he had and treasured it. "Mom died 4 months ago," Grace said quietly. "Cancer. She fought it for 2 years, but in the end," she stopped, swallowed. "Near the end, she told me I should find you. Said she'd forgiven you years ago for leaving, that she understood you were sick and didn't know how to get help. She said you deserved to know that she'd had a good life after you left, that she'd remarried and been happy, but that she'd never stopped hoping you'd find peace." Eli couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Sarah was dead. The woman he'd loved and failed and left, who he'd imagined somewhere in Colorado, living a better life without him. She was gone, and she'd forgiven him, had sent their daughter to tell him so. "I wanted to hate you," Grace continued. Her voice was steady, but tears ran down her face unchecked. "For years I did hate you. I told myself you were a coward and a drunk, and I was better off without you. But Mom never spoke badly of you. She always said you were a good man who got lost, and that getting lost wasn't the same as being bad. She gestured at the garden around them. When I heard you were restoring this place, I didn't understand why. It seemed random. But now that I'm here seeing it, she paused, looking at the terraced beds, the stone walls, the pond with its hand-painted tiles. This is what you used to do with me. Teaching me to plant things, to take care of them. You were good at that, patient and kind. That's the father I remember from before the drinking got bad. Eli found his voice, though it came out broken. I'm sorry. Grace, I'm so sorry. I thought leaving was protecting you. I thought I was too damaged to be around, that you'd be better off. We needed you, Grace interrupted. Not the drunk version, not the angry version. We needed you to get help and stay. We needed you to fight for us, instead of running away. I know, Eli said. I know that now. But I didn't know it then. I was so deep in it, so convinced I was poison. He stopped, the words inadequate. 30 years of regret, and there were no words big enough to contain it. Grace wiped at her tears with the back of her hand. I didn't come here to punish you. I came because Mom asked me to, and because... She looked at him directly, her eyes Sarah's eyes, holding his gaze. Because I'm 42 years old, and I've spent 30 years angry at a ghost. I need to know who you actually are. Not who I remember, not who I've imagined, but who you are right now. Eli looked down at the photograph in his hand, at the family they'd been, and then around at the garden he'd been restoring. 2 abandoned things, brought back to life through persistent work and faith that beauty could survive even the hardest times. I don't know if I can answer that, he said slowly. I don't know if I know who I am anymore, but I can tell you what I've learned here. He gestured at the garden. This belonged to a woman named Lucia and her father. They built it in the 1930s, poured everything they had into making something beautiful in hard country. Then they lost each other, and she had to walk away from it to survive. He told her about finding the tin box, about Lucia's letters and journals, about Miguel's marker and the months he'd spent clearing paths and restoring channels and setting broken tiles back into place. I've been working on this garden because it was something I could fix, he said. Something I could restore, even though I couldn't restore what I'd broken in my own life. But every day I've been here, I've thought about you, about those tomatoes you planted, about the letter you left in my truck that I've carried for 30 years. Grace's eyes widened. You kept that? Never could let it go. Couldn't read it for most of those years, but I couldn't throw it away either. He paused, then added, I've been writing you letters. Haven't sent them. Didn't think I had the right, but I've been trying to find words for what I should have said 3 decades ago. They stood in silence for a long moment, the afternoon light slanting through the trees, casting dappled shadows across the restored terraces. Clementine wandered over and nuzzled Grace's shoulder, and Grace reached up to stroke the donkey's nose with a small, surprised laugh. Is this yours? She asked. Her name's Clementine. She's the one who found this place. Stubborn old thing wouldn't leave until I followed her through that gate. Grace looked at him then, really looked at him, and Eli saw something shift in her expression. Not forgiveness exactly, that would take time if it came at all, but something softer than anger, something like possibility. I took a week off work, she said. Drove here from Colorado. I have a hotel in Tres Hermanas, but I thought... She hesitated. Could I see what you've been working on? Could you show me Lucia's garden? Eli nodded, not trusting his voice. Together, they walked the paths he'd cleared, and he told her about each section, the spring and its stone channels, the herb beds and the wild roses, the pond with its spiral of river stones and restored tiles. He showed her Miguel's marker beneath the fig tree, and he read her passages from Lucia's journal about faith and growing things and the cruel kindness of pruning. And as they walked, as he shared what he'd learned in this abandoned garden, Eli began to understand what Lucia had known when she sealed the gate 80 years ago, that sometimes letting go and sometimes holding on required the same courage, that walking away to survive wasn't the same as walking away from fear, that the measure of a life wasn't in the mistakes you made, but in what you did with the time you had left to make something right. Grace stayed. Not at the hotel in Tres Hermanas, but in Esperanza, in one of the other abandoned houses that still had most of its roof. Eli helped her clean it out, sweeping away years of dust and pack rat debris, boarding up broken windows, making it habitable if not comfortable. She had a sleeping bag and camping gear in her car, she said. She'd come prepared for the possibility that finding him might take longer than expected. They fell into a routine over the next 3 days. Mornings, they worked together in the garden. Grace proved to have the same gift she'd shown as a child, an intuitive understanding of what plants needed, where they should go, how to tend them without being either too rough or too tentative. She moved through the terraces with the confidence of someone who'd spent years with her hands in soil, and Eli learned that she worked for a landscape architecture firm in Denver, designing gardens for corporate campuses and public parks. After you left, she told him on the second morning, Mom encouraged me to keep gardening, said it was something you'd given me, and that I shouldn't let your absence take it away. So I started working summers at a nursery when I was 14. Studied horticulture and design in college, built a career out of what you taught me. The words landed like stones in Eli's chest, heavy and hard. She'd taken his one good gift and made something of it while he'd been running from ranch to ranch, drinking away the memory of what he'd lost. They didn't talk much while they worked. The silences were easier than conversation. The physical labor providing a framework that didn't require them to navigate the complicated territory of forgiveness and failure. But in those silences, Eli could feel something shifting. Not healing exactly. The wound was too old and deep for that, but maybe the beginning of understanding. In the afternoons, Grace would disappear to her temporary house or walk into Tres Hermanas for supplies, giving them both space. Eli used those hours to read more of Lucia's journal, finding passages he wanted to share with Grace, looking for wisdom from a woman dead 80 years, who somehow understood more about loss and restoration than he'd learned in a lifetime. On the third evening, Grace came to his door with a bottle of wine and 2 plastic cups. I thought we should talk, she said. Really talk, not just work in silence. They sat on the porch as the sun set, the desert around them painted in shades of orange and purple. Grace poured the wine. Eli took his cup but didn't drink, just held it, feeling the weight of it and the temptation it represented. I stopped drinking 30 years ago, he said. The day after I left. Went cold turkey. Nearly killed me doing it alone in a motel room in Utah. But I knew it was the drinking that had broken everything. And I couldn't let it keep destroying me even after I'd already destroyed you and your mother. Grace studied him. Why didn't you come back? If you'd gotten sober, why didn't you come home? I was ashamed, terrified, convinced that the damage was too deep to fix. And he paused, searching for honesty. Part of me thought you were better off believing I was just gone, that it would be easier to hate a disappearing father than to deal with one who came back sober but still carried all that history. That wasn't your choice to make, Grace said quietly. You didn't get to decide what was easier for us. You just decided what was easier for you. The truth of it was undeniable. You're right, Eli said. I was a coward. I've been a coward for 30 years, and nothing I do now can change that. They sat in silence for a while. Grace drank her wine. Eli set his cup aside, untouched. Mom used to say that courage wasn't about never being afraid, Grace finally said. It was about doing the hard thing even when you're terrified. She lived that. Raised me alone, went back to school, became a teacher, eventually met Michael and married him. She built a good life out of what you left behind. That was courage. She was always braver than me. So what's your courage now? Grace asked, turning to face him directly. Now that I've found you, now that you know Mom forgave you before she died, what are you going to do? Eli didn't have an answer. He looked out at the darkening desert, at the lights just beginning to show in Tres Hermanas in the distance, and felt the weight of the question settle over him. The next morning, Grace suggested they explore more of the garden together, searching for anything they might have missed. They worked systematically through the sections Eli had already cleared, looking beneath overgrown plants and in corners he hadn't yet reached. It was Grace who found the seed cabinet. It was tucked against the northern wall, beneath a juniper that had grown up around it, its branches providing shelter from the worst of the weather. The cabinet itself was metal, painted green, with multiple shallow drawers like an old library card catalogue. Rust had sealed most of the drawers shut, but Grace worked at them patiently with a screwdriver, prying them open one by one. Inside were seeds. Hundreds of packets of seeds, each one carefully labeled in Lucia's handwriting with the plant name, the year collected, and notes about the variety. Most were too old to be viable. 80 years was far beyond the lifespan of most seeds. But as they sorted through them, reading the labels and imagining the garden Lucia had envisioned, they found a few packets that had been vacuum-sealed in glass jars, protected from air and moisture. Tomatoes, Grace said, holding up a jar. Saved from 1935. Heritage variety from Papa's mother's garden in Pennsylvania. Sweet and productive. Plant deep. She looked at Eli, and something passed between them. A memory of another time, another garden, another moment when tomatoes had meant connection and hope. Could they still grow? She asked. Maybe, Eli said. Seeds have surprised people before. If they were kept dry and sealed, maybe. They found other jars too. Beans from 1934, labeled drought-tolerant, Mexican variety. Squash seeds from 1933, excellent keeper. Sweet flesh, and tucked in the back of the bottom drawer, a jar of flower seeds labeled simply for beauty in hard times. Plant and remember what's possible. Grace set all the jars on a flat stone in the sunlight. We should try to grow them, she said. Even if they don't germinate, we should try. Eli understood what she was really saying. That trying mattered even when success wasn't guaranteed. That planting seeds was an act of faith, whether or not they sprouted. That you honored the past by carrying it forward, not by preserving it in unchanging stasis. That afternoon, they prepared a bed for planting. It was early November, late for most things, but the high desert had its own calendar. With the spring water flowing and the careful microclimate Lucia and her father had created, they might have a chance. They worked the soil, adding compost Eli had been building from garden waste, breaking up clumps and removing stones. As they worked, Grace talked about her life, about the stepfather who'd been kind but never tried to replace Eli, who'd treated her like his own but never pretended he was her father. About college and her first jobs and the mistakes she'd made along the way. About a marriage that had ended in divorce 5 years ago. About deciding she didn't want children of her own. About the quiet satisfaction she found in her work designing spaces where other people could find peace. And Eli, haltingly at first but with growing ease, talked about his years on the road. About the ranches he'd worked, the skills he'd learned, the loneliness that had been both punishment and refuge. About finding Clementine and this garden, about reading Lucia's letters and recognizing himself in her loss and her courage. I think I was looking for a way back, he said, his hands in the soil they were preparing. Not back to you and Sarah, I knew that was impossible, but back to being someone who could grow things instead of just surviving. Back to being the man in that photograph you brought, even if that man only existed for a little while before I lost him. Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Mom used to tell me that people aren't fixed things. We're always changing, always becoming. The father I remember from when I was 10, and the drunk who left when I was 12, and the man sitting here planting seeds with me now, those are all you. You don't get to disown the bad parts, but you also don't have to be defined only by them. They opened the first jar, the tomatoes from Lucia's grandmother's garden. The seeds inside were shriveled and dark, unpromising, but they planted them anyway, pressing them gently into the soil, spacing them the way Eli had taught Grace 30 years ago. Plant deep, water right, have faith that life wants to live. They planted the beans and the squash and finally the flowers, those seeds saved for beauty in hard times. As they worked, Eli thought about Lucia planting these same varieties, saving their seeds year after year, believing that someone might someday need them. She'd left instructions and maps, letters and journals, tiles and stone channels. And she'd left seeds the most fundamental gift a gardener can give, the possibility of continuation. The promise that growth doesn't have to end just because one person stops tending. When they finished planting, they stood back and looked at the freshly worked bed with its neat rows and small markers, indicating what they'd planted where. It looked like nothing much, just dark soil and hope. But Eli felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for 3 decades. "They probably won't grow," Grace said, but she was smiling slightly. "These seeds are ancient. The odds are against them." "Probably not," Eli agreed. "But we'll water them anyway. We'll tend them. We'll give them every chance we can." She looked at him then, and he saw his daughter clearly for the first time since she'd arrived. Not the ghost of the 12-year-old he'd abandoned, but the woman she'd become, strong and capable, and carrying her wounds with a grace he'd never mastered. "Is that what we're doing?" she asked. "Giving each other a chance despite the odds?" Eli nodded. "If you're willing. I know I don't deserve it. I know 30 years is too long, and some things can't be undone. But we're here," Grace finished, "and these seeds are in the ground. And tomorrow we'll water them and see what happens." "Yeah," Eli said. "Tomorrow we'll see what happens." That evening, they made dinner together in his small kitchen. Nothing fancy, just pasta and sauce from a jar. But they sat at the table, where he'd spread out Lucia's letters and journals, and they talked like 2 people who were beginning to know each other, not as father and daughter burdened by the past, but as 2 adults who'd both been shaped by loss and were tentatively reaching towards something that might, with care and time and persistence, grow into understanding. Outside, the garden rested in darkness, its restored paths and terraces holding the seeds they'd planted, holding the promise of growth or the acceptance of failure. Either way, the work of tending would continue. That was what gardens taught you, what people like Lucia and Miguel and Grace and even Eli himself eventually learned. That the work of growing things, of caring for life, of trying to make beauty in hard places, that work never really ended. It just changed hands, passed from one tender to the next, each one adding their own labor to the ongoing act of faith that tomorrow could be better than today. Grace stayed for a week. Each morning they checked the planted beds together, though they both knew nothing would show for weeks, if it was going to show at all. They worked on other sections of the garden, clearing more paths, repairing walls, pruning trees that had grown wild and misshapen. The work gave shape to their days and structure to their tentative reconciliation. But on the 6th evening, as they sat on Eli's porch, watching the sun set over the hills, Grace said, "I have to drive back tomorrow. I've been away from work too long already." Eli felt something drop in his chest, a disappointment sharp and immediate. He'd known she couldn't stay indefinitely, but the knowing didn't make it easier. "I understand," he said. "I'd like to come back," Grace continued. "Maybe for Thanksgiving if you'd want that. Or Christmas. We could keep doing this. Keep trying." "I'd like that," Eli said, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in years. They sat in silence for a while. Then Grace said, "Can I ask you something?" "Anything. In your letters, the ones you said you've been writing, what did you tell me? What have you been trying to say all this time?" Eli felt his throat tighten. "The truth, mostly. Things I should have said 30 years ago. Apologies that don't begin to cover what I did. Attempts to explain what can't really be explained. Can I read them?" The question hung in the air between them. Those letters were the most honest things Eli had written in his life, raw and unguarded in ways he'd never been in person. The idea of Grace reading them, of her seeing that unvarnished version of his shame and regret and desperate hope, made him feel stripped bare. But wasn't that what courage was? What Sarah had tried to teach him and what he'd been too afraid to learn? Doing the hard thing even when you were terrified? "Wait here," he said. He went inside and retrieved Lucia's journal from where he kept it on the shelf above his bed. The letters were tucked between its pages, 9 of them now, written over the past weeks as he'd worked in the garden and thought about what he wanted to say to his daughter if he ever got the chance. He brought them out and handed them to Grace without ceremony. "They're not finished," he said. I kept trying to get them right, but I don't know if I ever did. Grace took them carefully, as if they might disintegrate in her hands. Should I read them now? If you want to. I'll be with Clementine. He needed to give her privacy, needed to not watch her face as she read through his failures one more time. He walked to the corral where Clementine stood, watching the evening sky. He stroked her dusty neck and tried not to think about what Grace was reading, tried not to imagine her judgment or her pain. The donkey leaned into him, solid and warm and uncomplicated in her affection. Time stretched out. The sun dropped below the horizon. Stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Eli stayed with Clementine, murmuring to her about nothing in particular. About the garden and the seeds and the fear that lived in his chest like a permanent weight. When Grace finally came to find him, her face was wet with tears, but her expression was steady. She held the letters in one hand, and when she reached him, she handed them back. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Thank you for letting me see them. I meant every word. I know you did. That's what makes them so hard to read." She paused, wiping at her eyes. "You wrote in one of them that you didn't think you deserved forgiveness, that you weren't asking for it. I'm not." "I know what I did. Let me finish," Grace interrupted gently. "You wrote that you weren't asking for forgiveness. But, Dad, I'm not sure forgiveness is something you ask for. I think it's something that happens when you're both ready for it. When the person who was hurt has processed their pain, and when the person who caused it has actually changed." Eli felt tears prick his own eyes. "I have changed. I'm trying to change. I know it's late. I know it doesn't undo anything." "It doesn't undo it," Grace agreed. "But it matters anyway. The work you've done here in this garden, that matters. The sobriety you've maintained for 30 years, even when no one knew or cared, that matters. The letters you wrote, even though you thought you'd never send them, those matter too." She reached out and took his hand. The first physical contact they'd had since she'd arrived, except for the accidental brushes while working. Her hand was warm and calloused from the week of garden work, and Eli held it like the precious, fragile thing it was. "I'm not there yet," Grace said after a long moment. "I'm not at forgiveness yet, and I don't know if I ever will be completely. The 12-year-old in me, who waited for you to come home, who kept watering those tomatoes long after they died, she still hurts. She probably always will." Eli nodded, not trusting his voice. "But the woman I am now," Grace continued, "she understands more than that 12-year-old could. She understands addiction and mental health and how people can be broken and not know how to fix themselves. She understands that sometimes leaving is the only way someone knows to stop the bleeding, even if it's the wrong choice." "It was the wrong choice," Eli said hoarsely. "I should have stayed and gotten help. Should have fought for you and your mother instead of running." "Yes," Grace said simply. "You should have. And we'll probably have to talk about that more, work through it more, maybe with a therapist or just between us over time. This isn't fixed because we planted some seeds and I read your letters. This is going to take years, Dad. Years of showing up, of being present, of proving that you've actually changed." "I know, but I want to try," she said. "I want us to try. And I think—" She paused, looking back toward Eli's house, toward the porch where she'd sat reading his letters. "I think Mom would want that too." They stood together in the gathering darkness, holding hands, neither speaking for a while. Then Grace said, "I have an idea. If you're willing, anything. I want to create something for Mom here in the garden, a memorial, something that honors her and acknowledges that she's part of this story too, even though she never saw this place." Eli felt something shift in his chest. "I'd like that. What did you have in mind? A bench, maybe? Or a marker? Something we could make together, something permanent that says she mattered, that she forgave you and that her forgiveness was a gift, not an obligation." They spent the rest of the evening planning it. Grace sketched ideas on the back of one of Eli's seed packets, while he made suggestions based on what he'd learned about working with stone and metal in the garden. They finally settled on a simple marker, a flat stone engraved with Sarah's name and dates, placed near the fig tree, where Eli had found Lucia's tin box. The next morning, Grace's last day before she had to leave, They drove into Tres Hermanas together to find a suitable stone. The woman at the hardware store directed them to a man who worked with stone professionally, an older Mexican gentleman named Carlos, who listened to their request and nodded thoughtfully. "For your wife?" he asked Eli in accented English. "His wife," Grace corrected gently. "My mother." Carlos looked between them, reading something in their faces that made him nod again. "I have something," he said, and led them to his workshop behind the store. The stone he showed them was perfect, smooth river granite, roughly 18 inches square, dark grey with lighter veining running through it. Carlos quoted them a price for the engraving that was more than fair, and when Eli tried to negotiate, the old man waved him off. "For a memorial, I do not overcharge," he said firmly. "Tell me what you wanted to say." They stood together, Eli and Grace, looking at the blank stone, and finally Grace said, "Sarah Jane Monroe, beloved mother, teacher, friend. She taught us about courage and second chances." Carlos wrote it down carefully, then looked at them. "When do you need it?" "I'm leaving today," Grace said. "Driving back to Colorado. Could we pick it up on my next visit?" "Give me 2 weeks," Carlos said. "I'll have it ready." They shook hands, and as they walked back to the truck, Grace said, "When I come back for Thanksgiving, we'll set it in place together. We'll make it part of the garden." "She would have loved this place," Eli said. "Sarah, I mean. She always wanted a big garden. We had that small one in Colorado, but she used to talk about having acres someday, about growing everything under the sun." "She had a garden in the house she shared with Michael," Grace said. "Not acres, but substantial. She grew vegetables for the whole neighborhood, gave them away to anyone who asked. She said growing things kept her connected to the good parts of life." Eli felt tears, threatening again, but pushed them back. "I'm glad she had that. I'm glad she had Michael and you and a garden. I'm glad she didn't spend 30 years as alone as I did." "She wasn't alone," Grace said. "But she missed you anyway. Even after everything, even after she'd built a new life, she missed the man you were before the drinking. The man who taught his daughter to plant tomatoes deep and water them right." They drove back to Esperanza in comfortable silence, and Eli helped Grace pack up her car. She'd be on the road by noon, making the long drive back to Denver and her job and her life there. But she'd be back. They'd set Sarah's marker together, and they'd check on the seeds they'd planted, and they'd continue the work of building something new from what had been broken. As Grace pulled away, dust rising behind her car on the rutted road, Eli stood with Clementine and watched until she disappeared from sight. Then he walked to the garden, to the beds where they'd planted Lucia's ancient seeds. And he watered them carefully, giving them every chance to grow, despite the odds stacked against them. Above him, the fig tree spread its branches against the bright New Mexico sky, its roots deep in soil that had been tended for nearly a century by different hands with different stories, but the same fundamental hope that tomorrow might bring new growth, that care and patience might yield beauty, that even the longest winter eventually gives way to spring. 3 weeks passed. Eli worked in the garden every day, finishing projects he'd started and beginning new ones. He repaired the last of the collapsed walls, cleared the final overgrown sections, and began planning what he'd plant in the spring when the danger of hard frost had passed. The garden was coming back to itself, revealing its original design while also showing the marks of its long abandonment, wearing its history like an old man wears scars, with the kind of dignity that comes from surviving. He wrote Grace letters, actual letters that he mailed this time, telling her about his progress and his plans. She wrote back, her letters arriving every few days, telling him about her work and her life, sharing memories of Sarah, asking questions about the garden and about him. They were finding their way to each other through paper and ink, building a relationship that acknowledged the past without being imprisoned by it. On a morning in late November, Eli checked the beds where they'd planted Lucia's seeds, as he did every morning. He expected nothing. It was too early, the seeds too old, the odds too long. But as he knelt beside the tomato row, his bad knees protesting, he saw it, green, a tiny curve of green pushing up through the dark soil. His hands shook as he bent closer, hardly daring to believe it. But yes, there it was, a seedling, its cotyledons just unfurling. Impossibly alive after 80 years of waiting in the dark. He sat back on his heels and felt tears come. Not of sadness this time, but of something else entirely. Wonder, maybe, or gratitude, or the simple, overwhelming recognition that life persisted against all reason, that hope sometimes proved itself justified in the most unexpected ways. He checked the other rows and found more. 3 bean seedlings, 2 squash plants, and in the flower bed, a dozen tiny shoots that might be the seeds Lucia had saved for beauty in hard times. Clementine wandered over and nuzzled his shoulder. And Eli laughed, the sound rusty from disuse but genuine. They grew, he told her. After everything, they actually grew. Grace arrived 2 days before Thanksgiving, her car loaded with supplies for a proper meal. Eli met her at the garden gate, where she'd first found him, and before he said anything else, he led her to the seed beds and showed her the sprouting plants. She knelt in the soil without caring about her genes, touching the tiny leaves with careful fingers. "They're real," she said, her voice full of wonder. 80-year-old seeds, and they're actually growing. Lucia would be pleased, Eli said. All her planning, all that careful preservation, it worked. They spent that afternoon together in the garden, preparing for the setting of Sarah's memorial. Carlos had finished the engraving exactly as they'd requested, and Eli had prepared a spot near the fig tree, level and positioned to catch the morning light. On Thanksgiving morning, they set the marker in place. It was simple ceremony, just the 2 of them and Clementine, no formal words or rituals. They dug the hole together, positioned the stone, and filled in around it with earth from the garden. When it was done, they stood before it in silence. Eli with his hand on Grace's shoulder, both of them thinking about the woman whose name was now part of this place. "She would have liked being remembered here," Grace finally said. "Among growing things, in a place that's about second chances." "I wish I could tell her I'm sorry," Eli said. "I wish I could thank her for raising you, for forgiving me, for being strong enough to build a good life without me." "I think she knows," Grace said. "I think somehow she knows you're trying." They made Thanksgiving dinner together in Eli's small kitchen, nothing fancy, but honest food shared between people who were learning to be family again. They talked about the garden's future, about what they'd plant in spring, about whether Grace might be able to visit more regularly, maybe even work remotely from Esperanza for a few weeks at a time. As evening fell and they sat on the porch watching the sky turn colors, Grace said, "I've been thinking about something. What's that? This garden shouldn't just be for us. Lucia created it to be beautiful, to prove that you could make things grow, even in hard country. Maybe we should share that with other people. Open it up sometimes, let folks come see it, learn from it." Eli considered this. The garden had been his refuge, his private place of healing. But Grace was right. Lucia hadn't built it to be hidden away forever. She'd built it to demonstrate possibility, to show what care and knowledge could accomplish. "We'd need to finish the restoration first," he said. "Get it properly back to her vision. We have time," Grace said. "We're not in a hurry." That night, after Grace had gone to her temporary house, Eli walked to the garden one last time. He stood beside Sarah's marker in the moonlight, beside the fig tree and the sprouting seeds, and he thought about the chain of hands that had tended this place. Miguel Alvarez planting with his daughter, Lucia maintaining it alone until she couldn't anymore. 80 years of wind and rain and neglect, and now him, an old cowboy who'd spent most of his life running from connection, learning finally to stay in one place and tend growing things. He thought about Grace driving back to Denver in a few days, but coming back again, about Lucia's seeds sprouting against all odds, about Sarah's forgiveness reaching across death to give him permission to try again, about Clementine finding this place when he'd been ready to give up on finding anything worth holding on to. The garden had taught him what Lucia's father had known, that tending anything, whether plants or relationships or your own damaged soul, was an act of faith. You did the work not knowing if it would bear fruit. You planted seeds and watered them and pulled the weeds and pruned away the dead wood, trusting that your labor might matter, might make a difference, might create something beautiful where there'd been only wilderness. Some years the drought won. Some years the insects devoured everything. But you kept planting, kept tending, kept believing that next year might be better. And sometimes, impossibly, miraculously, 80-year-old seeds pushed up through the soil and reached toward the sun. And you understood that hope wasn't naive optimism, but something harder and more valuable, the decision to keep trying even when the odds seemed impossible, the choice to believe in growth even in the hardest country, the courage to plant gardens in the desert and trust that, with care and time and faith, something beautiful might bloom. Eli Monroe was 68 years old, and he'd wasted 30 years running from his failures. But standing in Lucia's garden, with new shoots breaking through ancient soil, and his daughter's promise to return ringing in his ears, he finally understood that it wasn't too late, that as long as you had tomorrow, you had the chance to grow something worth leaving behind. The fig tree rustled in the night breeze, its branches spreading wide over the garden it had sheltered for nearly a century. And Eli turned toward home, toward Clementine waiting in her corral, toward another morning when he'd wake with the sun and return to this place and continue the work of tending, of growing, of making beauty in hard country one careful seed at a time.